At 24,000 feet, the roof of the aircraft tore off. It was not a window and it was not a panel. 18 feet of the upper fuselage was gone in less than a second. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 left Hilo on April 28, 1988, bound for Honolulu. There were 95 people aboard a Boeing 737, on a flight so short the crew barely finished climbing before they started down again. The aircraft was not old by the calendar, with 19 years in service. For an airliner, that is middle age rather than the end of a life. But this aircraft did something unusual, and to understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what it had been doing every day for 19 years. It flew island to island all day long, every day of the year. Hilo to Honolulu, then Honolulu to Maui, then Maui to Kauai. Some of those flights lasted 20 minutes and some lasted 30, and there were often 8 or 9 of them before the sun went down. Every single one of those flights meant a full pressurization cycle. Here is what that means. At altitude, the air outside an aircraft is too thin to breathe, so the cabin is pumped up to a pressure a human body can survive. The fuselage becomes a balloon, the metal skin stretches, and every rivet and seam and joint carries that load. Then the aircraft descends, the pressure equalizes, and the metal relaxes back into place. It stretches, and then it relaxes, and then it stretches again, over and over, thousands upon thousands of times. A single cycle does nothing at all, and 1,000 cycles do nothing you could measure. Metal is patient that way. But metal also remembers, and every cycle leaves something behind that never comes out again. By that morning, that airframe had completed almost 90,000 cycles, the second highest total of any Boeing 737 anywhere on Earth. Nobody was tracking that number as a limit because the industry measured hours in the air. And measured in hours, this aircraft looked completely ordinary. That morning, a passenger boarding at Hilo noticed something strange. There was a crack in the fuselage skin near the door, clearly visible from the boarding stairs. She said nothing to anyone about it. She assumed that if it mattered, somebody already knew. The aircraft climbed out over the ocean, the seatbelt sign went off, and the flight attendants began the cabin service. At 24,000 feet, a small crack in a riveted joint reached its limit. What happened next took less than 1 second. The cabin explosively decompressed. All the pressure inside, which had been pushing outward on every square inch of that fuselage, found an opening at last. The upper half of the aircraft, from just behind the cockpit back toward the wing, peeled away into the slipstream and was gone. Passengers who had been sitting inside an aircraft were now sitting in open sky. They were traveling at 400 miles an hour in air 40 degrees below zero, still strapped into their seats and still sitting in rows, with nothing above them but daylight, and the floor beneath them the only thing left holding the aircraft together. One flight attendant was standing in the aisle at that moment at the front of the cabin. She was swept out and she was never found. Another flight attendant had been thrown to the floor. She did not stand up because standing up meant leaving the aircraft. So she crawled instead, up and down what was left of that aisle in a 400-mile-an-hour wind, checking on passengers and telling people to keep their heads down. In the cockpit, the door was gone as well. The captain turned in his seat and saw blue sky where the first-class ceiling should have been. The noise was beyond anything either pilot had ever trained for. They could not hear each other, they could not hear the radios, and they could not hear their own engines. Everything they knew about that aircraft now had to be read from the instruments, because sound had been taken away from them entirely. So understand the situation precisely. They had an aircraft that was structurally failing in flight. They did not know how much of it was still attached, or whether the rest of it would hold together for another minute. They could not communicate with the ground, and they could not speak to each other except through hand signals. And they still had to land it. The nearest airport was Kahului, on the island of Maui, with a short runway and limited emergency equipment. Honolulu was safer, better staffed, and far better prepared for a mass casualty arrival. It was also much further away, and every extra minute in the air was another minute for the damage to spread. They turned toward Maui. Now came the harder problem, and this is the one that decided whether 94 people would live. To land, an aircraft must slow down and extend its flaps. Flaps are large surfaces that swing out from the wing to let an aircraft fly safely at lower speed. but extending them changes the loads running through the entire airframe. And nobody on Earth knew what this airframe could still carry. If they slowed down and configured for landing, the remaining structure might fold. If they stayed fast, they would arrive at a short island runway carrying far too much speed to stop on it, with a drop into the ocean waiting at the end. There was no correct answer here, and there was no procedure to follow. No manual anywhere in aviation covered an aircraft with its roof missing, because it had never happened before. Then the left engine failed. Then a warning light told them the nose gear might not be locked down. They were now flying a structurally compromised aircraft, on one engine, toward a short runway, with no radio contact and no certainty that the landing gear would hold when they touched it. You have 40 seconds. What do? They flew it. The captain committed to the approach and held the speed where he judged the structure would survive, using whatever control response the aircraft still had left. Every input was a guess, and every second the aircraft stayed in one piece was information he had not possessed a moment earlier. The first officer worked the radios completely blind, transmitting an emergency call to a tower she could not hear answer, and could only hope somebody down there had received. The aircraft was flying in a shape no engineer had ever designed for or tested or modeled. There was no wind tunnel data for this, and there was no simulator program for this. Every control input was an experiment with 94 lives attached to it. They put it on the runway at Kahului 13 minutes after the roof came off. 65 people were injured and 1 person died. Every other soul aboard walked away from an aircraft that had lost a third of its upper structure in flight. The emergency services on Maui were not equipped for anything of that size. Ambulances came in from across the island, and tour helicopters, aircraft built for sightseeing, flew the injured to the hospital. Now the part that matters. Investigators found that the crack had not been hiding at all. It had been visible. That passenger at Hilo had seen the beginning of the failure from the boarding stairs, minutes before stepping onto an aircraft that would come apart around her. The joints on that aircraft had been bonded with an adhesive that degraded over time. Moisture worked its way in, and corrosion spread beneath the surface where nobody could see it. Along a single line of rivets, dozens of tiny cracks had formed. Individually, every one of them was harmless. Any inspector would have looked at any single one of them and moved on without a second thought. Together they formed a perforated line. It was like the dotted line on a sheet of paper designed to tear, waiting for one more cycle. The industry gave this a name afterward, and they called it multiple site damage. Many small failures, none of them serious on their own, that linked together into one catastrophic failure. And the inspection system in place at the time was not built to find it. Inspectors were trained to look for one significant crack, and they were not looking for 100 insignificant ones sitting in a row, because nobody had yet understood that 100 insignificant cracks are not insignificant. Neither was the maintenance schedule built for it, because that schedule was based on flight hours, and this aircraft's damage had been caused by cycles. Every takeoff and landing stresses a fuselage far more than the hours of smooth cruise between them. An aircraft doing 20-minute island hops ages, structurally, many times faster than one crossing oceans. The paperwork said this aircraft was middle-aged. The metal disagreed. Investigators also concluded that the airline's maintenance program had failed to detect the damage, and that the FAA's oversight of that program had not been adequate. The warning signs about this type of joint had already existed. They had simply not been acted on with the urgency they required. So the rules changed. Congress passed the Aviation Safety Research Act later that same year, and the Federal Aviation Administration launched a national research program into aging aircraft. Airworthiness directives went out across the entire world fleet. Pressurization cycles became a tracked and limiting number, rather than a footnote in a logbook. Inspection programs were rewritten to hunt for distributed damage instead of single cracks. Mandatory structural modification became a requirement for older airframes rather than a recommendation. Aircraft reaching defined limits now face inspection regimes that simply did not exist before that morning. If you have flown anywhere in the last 30 years, you flew on an aircraft maintained under rules that were rewritten because of what happened over Maui in 1988. 95 people boarded that aircraft and one of them did not come home. The rest are the reason the rest of us do. That's the rule. Now you know who paid for it.